They said the quietest man in Dust Hollow once walked into the middle of a gunfight without saying a word, and walked out with someone else's life in his hands. But no one knew why, until the day a girl was left at the station with $1 in a suitcase, and he was the only one who noticed she didn't belong to the kind of endings this town usually handed out. The train hadn't even fully stopped hissing before they pushed her off. No goodbye worth remembering, no second glance, just a worn suitcase landing harder than it should, and a girl stumbling after it. Boots too thin for the dust, and eyes too stubborn to cry where anyone could see. Lena Hart stood there long after the doors slammed shut again, her fingers still gripping the handle of that suitcase like it was the last thing tying her to something steady, watching as the train pulled away and took with it the last piece of certainty she had left, leaving behind nothing but a single dollar folded in her coat pocket and a silence that felt heavier than the desert heat. Dust Hollow wasn't the kind of place that welcomed people. It sized them up, decided their worth in a heartbeat, and either used them or broke them depending on what seemed easier. And from the moment Lena stepped off that platform, every pair of eyes that landed on her had already made its decision. Some watched with curiosity, some with quiet calculation, and some with the kind of indifference that hurt worse than either, but none of them stepped forward, none of them offered help, and none of them expected her to last longer than a few days. None of them, except one man who didn't stop, didn't stare, didn't even slow his stride as he passed by with his hat tipped just low enough to hide his eyes, but somehow saw more than all of them combined. Caleb Rourke wasn't the kind of man people understood, which was exactly how he preferred it. He spoke only when necessary, worked harder than anyone in town, and kept a distance so deliberate it felt like a boundary no one dared cross. And over time the stories about him had grown into something almost myth-like. Some said he'd killed men without hesitation. Others claimed he hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in years. But what everyone agreed on was simple. If Caleb Rourke noticed you, it meant something had already gone wrong. Lena didn't know any of that yet, but she felt it anyway, the strange absence of judgment when he passed her, the way he didn't look at her like she was already defeated, and for reasons she couldn't explain. That was the first thing that made this place feel survivable. By nightfall, the station had emptied, the last traces of movement replaced by long shadows and locked doors, and Lena found herself with nowhere to go except the narrow space behind the general store, where the wooden boards blocked just enough wind to make it bearable if she curled in tight and kept her suitcase close. Hunger came first, sharp and demanding, followed by exhaustion that dragged at her bones until even fear couldn't keep her awake, and as she drifted into a restless sleep, she told herself she would figure something out in the morning, that she had to. But Dust Hollow didn't wait for people to recover. It tested them the moment they let their guard down, and when Lena woke at first light, her hand instinctively reached for the inside of her coat, only to find the pocket empty, the single dollar she had left gone without a trace, stolen in the night by someone who knew exactly how much that loss would cost her. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't react, just stared at the space where certainty used to be, and then she inhaled slowly, steadying herself the only way she knew how, by refusing to fall apart where anyone might see. The town was already waking up around her, boots hitting dirt, voices carrying across the street, life continuing as if nothing had changed, because for them, nothing had, and Lena understood something important in that moment. If she didn't fight for a place here, she wouldn't exist at all. So she stood, brushed the dust from her coat, picked up her suitcase, and walked straight into the heart of a town that had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble, her steps slower than she wanted but steadier than anyone expected. She tried the saloon first, turned away before she could finish her sentence. Then the boarding house, no vacancies, no exceptions. The mercantile, no credit, no work, no interest, and with each rejection, the weight of her situation pressed harder against her chest. But she didn't stop, because stopping meant accepting what everyone else had already decided for her. It was only when her legs began to ache and her options ran out that she noticed the farrier's shed on the edge of town, the rhythmic clang of metal against metal echoing out into the open air like something alive, something constant, something that didn't care who you were as long as you showed up. He was there, exactly where she had last seen him, sleeves rolled, movements precise and unhurried as he worked a piece of glowing iron into shape, sparks rising around him like fleeting stars, and for a moment, Lena hesitated, aware of how little she had left to offer and how much she was risking by asking. But then she stepped forward anyway, because there was nothing left to lose, her voice steadier than she felt as she spoke the only words that mattered now. "I can work." The hammer didn't stop, not even for a second. Caleb Rourke continued shaping the metal as if he hadn't heard her at all, the sound filling the space between them, heavy and final, and for anyone else, that would have been the answer. But Lena didn't leave. She set her suitcase down near the wall, rolled up her sleeves, and began gathering the scattered tools on the workbench, cleaning what she could, organizing what didn't make sense, moving with a quiet determination that didn't ask for permission. Minutes passed, then more. The hammering slowed, then stopped, and for the first time since she'd spoken, the silence between them shifted into something different, something uncertain. Caleb glanced at her, just once, his expression unreadable, his gaze lingering a fraction longer than necessary before he turned back to his work without a word. But this time, he didn't tell her to leave. And in Dust Hollow, that kind of silence wasn't rejection. It was something far more dangerous. It was acceptance. The town said Caleb Rourke had buried his past so deep, not even the desert could dig it back up. But Lena Hart wasn't the kind of person who let silence stay buried. And somewhere between the sound of hammer on iron and the quiet way he allowed her to exist beside him, she began uncovering pieces of a man who had long ago decided the world wasn't worth speaking to. The days settled into a rhythm that no one in Dust Hollow quite understood. She arrived before the sun burned the chill off the air, sweeping the shed, hauling water, mending what little could be fixed, while Caleb worked without instruction, without complaint, and without acknowledgement beyond the occasional glance that seemed to measure something he hadn't yet named. He still hadn't asked her to stay, hadn't offered payment, hadn't even said her name, but he also hadn't turned her away, and in a place like this, that quiet tolerance felt more solid than any promise. Lena filled the silence the only way she knew how. Soft comments at first, then stories she wasn't sure he was listening to, observations about the town, about the horses, about the way the wind shifted just before dusk like it was carrying secrets no one else cared to hear. And though Caleb never responded, she began to notice the smallest changes, the way his hammer slowed when she spoke, the way his shoulders seemed less rigid by the end of the day, the way he no longer avoided standing in the same space as her for more than a passing moment. It wasn't much, but it was something, and something was enough to keep her from giving up. By the end of the first week, she found the cabin. It sat just beyond the ridge, worn but sturdy, the kind of place built to last because someone once intended to stay, and when Caleb didn't stop her from following the path there one evening, she took that as permission to. Inside, the quiet was heavier than the shed, thicker somehow, like it had settled into the walls and refused to leave. Everything was clean but untouched, arranged with a care that hadn't been revisited in years, and there were details that didn't fit the man she thought she knew. A second cup on the shelf, a folded blanket draped over a chair that no one sat in, and on the far wall, a small framed photograph turned slightly away, as if even looking at it directly was too much. Lena didn't ask about it. Not yet. Instead, she lit the stove, cooked what little she could gather, and left a plate where he would see it, unsure if he would accept even that small offering. He did. Not immediately, not openly, but by morning the plate was empty, cleaned and placed back exactly where she had found it, and something about that quiet exchange felt more intimate than words ever could. Days turned into something steadier, something that almost resembled belonging, and for the first time since she had been left at that station, Lena stopped thinking in terms of survival and started thinking in terms of staying. But Dust Hollow didn't forget so easily. The whispers followed her now, quieter when she passed but sharper in their intent, questions without answers, judgments without evidence, and though no one confronted her directly, she could feel the shift in the way people looked at her, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had chosen a side, even if she didn't fully understand what that meant. It was late one afternoon when the truth began to surface, not in words but in the kind of moment that didn't leave room for misunderstanding. Lena had climbed the hill behind the cabin, chasing a breeze that carried a hint of something cooler, something cleaner, and that was when she saw it. A single grave, marked but not maintained, the wood weathered and worn, the name barely legible, but still there if you looked closely enough. She didn't need to read it to understand. The untouched chair, the second cup, the silence. It all settled into place with a weight that made her chest tighten. Caleb wasn't just quiet. He was grieving, and he had been for a long time. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt it, the shift in the air, the stillness that followed when he stopped a few feet behind her, his presence heavier here than anywhere else. Like this was the one place he couldn't pretend distance was enough. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lena turned, meeting his gaze without flinching, without pity, because she understood something important in that instant. Pity would only push him further away. "You don't have to tell me," she said softly, her voice steady despite the way the moment pressed in around them. His jaw tightened, the only sign that her words had landed at all, and for a second, it looked like he might turn and walk away like he always did when things got too close, too real. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward, just enough to stand beside her, his eyes fixed on the grave as if it still held something he hadn't been able to let go of. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and used, like it had to force its way past years of silence just to exist. "I was late." 2 words. That was all. But it was enough. Lena didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. Because in those 2 words lived everything. The loss, the guilt, the reason he stayed, the reason he stopped speaking, the reason he had built his world small enough that nothing else could be taken from him again. And in that moment, standing beside him in a silence that finally meant something shared instead of something empty, Lena made a choice she hadn't realized she was building toward since the day she arrived. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Maybe not at all. But peace in places like Dust Hollow was never meant to last, and it came riding in just as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading into town. 3 men, well dressed in a way that didn't belong, their horses too clean, their eyes too sharp, the kind of men who didn't ask for permission because they were used to getting what they wanted without it. Lena saw them before Caleb did, her instincts tightening before her thoughts could catch up, and when they finally stopped in front of the shed the next morning, their presence felt like a disruption that couldn't be undone. "Rourke," one of them called, his voice smooth but edged with something colder underneath. "We've got business to discuss." Caleb didn't answer right away, his stance unchanged, his expression unreadable, but Lena saw it, the slight shift in his posture, the tension that hadn't been there before, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath waiting for what would come next. The man's gaze moved to her then, slow and deliberate, taking her in with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and in that moment, Lena understood something just as clearly as she had at the grave. She wasn't invisible anymore. And in Dust Hollow, being seen by the wrong people could cost you everything. They always said silence was Caleb Rourke's shield, but the night those men decided to test its limits, the whole town learned it could just as easily become a weapon, and Lena Hart would be the reason he finally stopped holding it back. The tension didn't break all at once. It stretched, slow and deliberate, tightening over the next few days like a rope pulled just a little too far each time those railroad men returned, their smiles thinner, their patience shorter, their intentions clearer with every word they didn't bother to hide. They weren't asking anymore. They were circling. Caleb refused them the same way he refused everything. With silence, with stillness, with a refusal to bend that said more than any threat could. But men like that didn't respect quiet strength. They exploited it. And when they realized Caleb wouldn't move, they shifted their focus to the one thing in his life that had changed. Lena. It started small, lingering stares, comments spoken just loud enough for her to hear, a presence that followed her through town like a shadow she couldn't shake, and she tried to ignore it, tried to believe that keeping her head down would be enough, because for the first time since she had been left at that station, she had something worth holding on to. But Dust Hollow had its own way of teaching lessons, and it didn't care who paid the price. The night it happened, the air felt wrong before anything even began. Too still, too quiet, like the desert itself was waiting. Lena had stayed later than usual, finishing small tasks in the shed while Caleb worked through a stubborn piece of iron, the rhythm between them familiar now, almost comforting, until it shattered under the sound of boots hitting dirt outside, heavy and uninvited. She turned first. They were already there. The 3 men stepped into the lantern light like they owned it, their expressions stripped of pretense, whatever politeness they had carried before now gone, replaced by something colder, something final. "We're done asking," the one in front said, his voice low, controlled, dangerous in a way that didn't need volume to be understood. Caleb didn't respond, didn't move. But Lena felt it. The shift, the coiled tension beneath his stillness, like something held back just enough to keep from snapping. "Maybe you don't understand," the man continued, his gaze sliding toward Lena with a deliberate cruelty that made her stomach tighten. "This isn't about you anymore." That was when Caleb stepped forward. Not fast, not sudden, just enough to place himself between them and her, his presence quiet but absolute, like a line drawn in the dirt that didn't need to be spoken aloud. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the men laughed, sharp and humorless, and before Lena could react, a hand closed around her arm, yanking her forward hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The world tilted, the ground shifting beneath her boots, and for the first time since she arrived in Dust Hollow, fear hit her fully, raw and undeniable. "Maybe this'll make you listen," the man said, tightening his grip as she struggled against him, her suitcase-long instincts kicking in even when she knew she couldn't win. And that was the moment everything changed. Caleb moved, not like before, not measured, not restrained. He closed the distance in a blur of motion so sudden it left no space to think, only react, his hand striking with a force that broke the man's grip on Lena and sent him staggering back, the crack of impact echoing louder than any gunshot in the stillness that followed. The other two reached for their weapons, but Caleb was already there, already ahead, his silence gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, certainty. The fight wasn't long. It wasn't loud, but it was decisive. When it ended, the three men were on the ground, their threats reduced to groans and bloodied pride, and Caleb stood over them, breathing steady, his gaze cold in a way Lena had never seen before, not empty but focused, like every piece of the past he had buried had just risen to the surface and found its purpose. "You're done here," he said, his voice low, rough, carrying more weight than any shout could have, and for the first time, they listened. They left before sunrise. No promises, no threats, just gone. And Dust Hollow, for once, didn't pretend it hadn't seen what happened. By morning, the whispers had changed, not gone, but different, edged with something closer to respect, maybe even fear, and Lena understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Not for the town, not for Caleb, not for her. The days that followed were quieter, but not the same kind of quiet. They carried something new, something unspoken but present, like the space between them had shifted into something neither of them quite knew how to name. Caleb spoke more now, not much, but enough. Small words, necessary ones, the kind that built something real instead of just holding distance. And Lena found herself listening just as much as she used to talk, learning the rhythm of a man who was finally stepping out of the silence he had built around himself. But the decision she had been avoiding since the beginning couldn't be delayed forever. The train came back. Same track, same platform, different choice. Lena stood there again, her suitcase in hand, the weight of it lighter now, but still familiar. The memory of that first day pressing in at the edges of her thoughts as the whistle echoed across the open land. This was her chance. A real one. A way forward that didn't depend on a town that had never wanted her, or a life built out of survival and stubbornness. Caleb stood a few steps behind her, just like before, his presence steady, unchanged in the ways that mattered most. He didn't try to stop her, didn't step closer, didn't reach out. "You can go," he said quietly, the words simple, honest, and harder than anything else he could have offered. Lena closed her eyes for a second, letting the sound of the train, the wind, the distant murmur of the town settle into something clear. Then she turned, not toward the train, toward him. "I know," she said, her voice steady, carrying none of the uncertainty she had felt when she first arrived, because this time, she wasn't choosing out of desperation. She was choosing because she could. She stepped away from the platform, the distance between them closing one quiet step at a time, and for a moment, Caleb didn't move, like he wasn't sure if this was real or just another thing the world might take back from him. Then he stepped forward too, not out of fear, not out of guilt, but because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't too late. And as the train pulled away behind them, carrying with it a future Lena no longer needed and a past Caleb had finally left behind, Dust Hollow stood witness to something it didn't often see. Not survival, not endurance, but the quiet, stubborn beginning of something that chose to stay.